In this episode, we give a brief history of moral panics through the ages, from the Romans, blood libel, witch hunts, the Salem witch trials, and the early lead up to the Satanic Panic in the 1900s. Sit back, relax, and roll the intro. Ritualistic Podcast, Season 2, The Satanic Panic.
666. That's worship of the devil.
They use blood in their ritual.
Moral panic. Noun. An instance of public anxiety or alarm in response to a problem regarded as threatening the moral standards of society. In his widely influential 1972 book, Folk Devils and Moral Panics, South African-born sociologist, criminologist and author Stanley Cohen wrote there are 5 stages of moral panic. These stages are: someone, something or a group are defined as a threat to social norms or community interests. The threat is then depicted in a simple and recognizable symbol or form by the media. Portrayal of this symbol rouses public concern. There is a response from authorities and policymakers. The moral panic over the issue results in social changes within the community. Of course, this applies to moral panics, and in earlier moral panics, the media can be substituted with the church or the king or queen of the time. An early example of moral panic is the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire over the almost 250-year span from 64 AD under the reign of Nero through to 313 AD when Constantine the Great and Licinius signed the Edict of Milan. Under Nero's rule, Christians were blamed for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The Great Fire ravaged large swathes of Rome and led to the economic devastation of the Roman people. Later, according to Tacitus' historical record, the Annals, Nero ordered the fires himself, and when accused of doing so blamed the Christians, who at the time were thought to be a dangerous sect who performed rites and rituals under the cover of night. Sounds familiar. The persecution of Christians continued along with the persecution of the Jews under Domitian's rule up to 96 AD. It is believed that this is when the Book of Revelations was written, as the Book of Revelations describes the social conflict and the excessive punishment that was prevalent under Domitian. This persecution continued through successive emperors Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, and Maximus the Thracian, with the most notable during 177 AD, when Christians in Lugdunum, which is modern-day Lyon in France, were ostracized from public space and led to the trials of Christians, where slaves testified that their Christian masters participated in acts of incest and cannibalism. In 250 AD, Decius issued an edict to restore traditional Roman values. In the edict, the kingdom were ordered to perform a sacrifice to the gods in the presence of a magistrate who would then grant the people assigned and witness libellus a certificate of participation in this edict. A number of bishops were executed under the reign of Valerian from 253 AD for refusing to partake in the sacrifices to the Roman gods, before Valerian's son became emperor in 260 AD and revoked the legislation. During the reign of Diocletian and Galerius, the support for the persecution of Christians began to wane, led by Constantine, with edicts not applied in Constantine's domain. And when Constantine's reign began in 306 AD, Christians were made legal, before in 313 co-signing with the Edict of Milan, the persecution was ceased completely. The Jewish people have long been the subject of persecution and anti-Semitic panic. A notable historical anti-Semitic panic was that of the blood libel, which saw Jews persecuted in England and Europe. One such case took place in the year 1114, when a 12-year-old boy named William, the son of Wenston and Elviva, was, according to Thomas of Monmouth, approached by a man claiming to be a cook for the Archdeacon of Norwich, and offered a job in the kitchens. William's mother was paid 3 shillings, and William went with the man on Holy Tuesday, February 29, 1114. William visited his aunt with the men, who became suspicious and asked her daughter to follow them as they left. with the daughter reporting that William and the man had gone to the home of a Jew, and William was not seen alive again. On Thursday, the 2nd of March, 1144, William was found dead in the woods of Mousehold Path, which is in Thorpwood just outside of Norwich, in England, by a nun, who initially did not notify anybody of the discovery. William's body was then rediscovered by Henry Disfropson, who was in the woods. He saw the boy's injuries, including a gag made of teasel, which is a flowering plant found locally. The man consulted a local priest, who decided to bury the boy on Easter Monday, before the family of the boy arrived and exhumed the body and confirmed the identity, and performed a full funeral. As William was last seen entering the home of a Jewish person with the man, this led the Norwich locals to accuse the Jews of ritual murder, and ordered local Jews to ecclesiastical court for trial. The local sheriff, Don Duchesne, advised them that due to being Jewish, the ecclesiastical court had no jurisdiction over them, and led them into hiding in the castle until the situation returned to normal. The death of William became legend, and when local monks moved William's body to a local monastery, he was seen as a martyr, and he gained a cult following in the Roman Catholic Church, with miracles even being attributed to him. In the official story of William's life, the life and miracles of St. William of Norwich, hagiographer Thomas of Monmouth made the claim that each Easter an international council of Jews would nominate a country where a ritual sacrifice of a Christian child would be performed, which, according to a, quote, Jewish prophecy, unquote, would ensure that the Jews would be restored to the Holy Land, and that in 1144 England was chosen, and the ritual was then delegated to the Jews of Norwich to abduct and crucify William. Over the centuries, there have been a number of witch hunt panics, such as during the Middle Ages throughout Europe and England, where there were waves of witch hunts during the 15th, 16th and 1700s. This is despite decrees within the Catholic Church banning witch hunting. The moral panic surrounding the witch hunts stemmed from a general lack of scientific knowledge surrounding things like weather and the human body at the time. This knowledge generally didn't come until later, and this was coupled with superstitions and fables such as werewolves. Between 1644 and 1647, Matthew Hopkins, the self-titled Witchfinder General, who was not sanctioned by Parliament, led the witch hunting charge, which resulted in the execution of around 300 alleged witches. Hopkins is believed to have been born sometime around 1619 and was the son of Puritan clergyman James Hopkins, the vicar of St. John's of Great Wenham in Suffolk, and Matthew lived and hunted in the East Anglia region of England. Hopkins' goal was not to prove that witches had performed magic or sorcery, but to prove that they had made a covenant with the devil. To do this required Hopkins and associate John Stern to make an accusation, and then to gain quote-unquote proof of being a witch, Hopkins would perform a number of investigations, such as he would often deprive them of sleep in order to elicit a confession. He would cut the accused on the arm with a blunt knife. If a person did not bleed, they would be considered a witch. He would conduct a swim test by tying the accused to a chair and then throw them in the water, with his belief being that as a witch, they had renounced their baptism, and as such the water would repel them. If the accused floated, or quote-unquote swam, they would be considered a witch, although this was abandoned after 1654, as he was warned he would need permission from the accused to perform this test. He would search the accused's body for the quote devil's mark. This was a mark, a defect, a mole or an extra nipple said to be devoid of feeling and would not bleed when cut. If no devil's mark was found, he would then shave all body hair and prick the accused with needles or knives to find invisible marks. And finally, they believed that a witch's familiar, for example a cat or a dog, would drink the blood from a devil's mark, similar to suckling on a mother's teat. After this, he would bring the accused in front of a justice of the peace presided over by the Earl of Warwick. 23 accused witches died, either before trial or after being sentenced to death. The rule of English law also reached across the Atlantic to Massachusetts. The Salem colony was settled in 1626 by a company of fishermen who would come across the site of a Native American village and a trading centre at the mouth of the Nonkag River, led by English colonist and dry salter Roger Conan. Later, in 1628, Salem Village was officially taken over by the Massachusetts Bay Colony by order of the Massachusetts Bay Company and led by John Endicott. Witchcraft was made illegal in England in 1641, and in 1684 England declared that its colonies could not self-govern. Not long after this declaration would come the first accusation of witchcraft, what would become known historically as the Salem Witch Trials. In 1689, Reverend Samuel Parris became the first ordained minister of Salem Village. Parris had moved to Salem Village from Boston shortly after the publication of Memorable Providences by Reverend Cotton Mather, which was about the last witch hanged in Boston in 1688, called Goodwife Goody Ann Glover, and the Reverend's attempt to persuade Goody to repent her witchcraft. A few short years later, in January of 1692, Reverend Parris's 9-year-old daughter Elizabeth Parris, and also his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, fell ill and began having fits, screaming, throwing items, making strange noises, and contorting themselves. Salem Village's doctor, William Griggs, was unable to determine the reason for the girl's illness, and for this reason he concluded that the girls were bewitched, and soon the hysteria spread to other youngsters, with Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, and Mary Warren presenting with similar symptoms. Parris's Caribbean-born slave Tituba baked a witch's cake made of rye and the urine. Parris's Caribbean-born slave Tituba baked a witch's cake, which is made of rye and the urine of the bewitched girls, which was fed to a dog believed to be a familiar of the devil, in the hope that it would counteract the spell and identify the person doing the bewitching. In late February, Elizabeth Parris identified Tituba as being the witch whom cast the spell, along with a homeless beggar named Sarah Good, and an elderly woman named Sarah Osborne, whom was subsequently arrested for witchcraft. The three women were brought in front of Salem Village's magistrates John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin, and a crowd of accusers and townsfolk. The magistrates would examine the women for witches' teats, which, as described in the English witch trial portion of this episode, was a teat that the witch's familiar would feed on. During the several-day trial, Good and Osborne maintained their innocence, but under questioning, Tituba confessed to practicing witchcraft and named her co-accused as witches in the service of the devil against the Puritans. She went on to describe how she was visited by black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, and a black man who wanted her to sign his book, and that a number of other witches were out to destroy the Puritans. Presumably, this fanciful confession was an attempt to save herself from conviction, but it did not save her, and all three women were found guilty of being witches and sent to prison in Boston. This was only the beginning, with Martha Corey, Bridget Bishop, and even 4-year-old Dorothy Good, the daughter of Sarah Good. It was Bishop who became the first of the 19 accused witches to be hanged on the Gallows Hill in Salem Village. All up, around 200 people had been accused of being witches, a number of whom died in jail awaiting trial. Salem Village would in 1752 become Danvers, Massachusetts, with Salem Town to the southeast of Salem Village becoming modern-day Salem. The Salem witch trials were brought into the public psyche and popular culture again in 1953, when Arthur Miller penned The Crucible, which is a play based around the trials of Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Parris. Although based in historical fact, some details were changed, such as the age of Williams being changed to 17, and the age of John Proctor being brought down from around 60 to a much younger age, and the relationship between the pair, which had no basis in fact. Many believe The Crucible uses the Salem witch trials as an allegory for McCarthyism, which was rife in the United States during the time of the play being written. McCarthyism was the moral panic within the ranks of the United States government, where people were accused of being communists. To explore McCarthyism, we have to go back to the first Red Scare, which took place in 1919 to 1921, post-World War I, in the United States, with anarchist bombings, race riots, labour strikes, and it was a time when the following of anarchist and communist philosophy was on the rise, as was the fear of the commie, with Attorney General Alexander Mitchell Palmer leading the Palmer Raids, where non-citizen socialists, anarchists, unionists, and immigrants were arrested, some 10,000 arrests by 1920. The panic calmed down under President Warren G. Harding, and subsequently the Coolidge administration after the death of Harding of a heart attack in 1923. However, post-Depression and World War II, the scare began to return, and in the late 1940s, with the beginning of the Cold War. On March 12, 1947, President Harry S. Truman announced to Congress his new foreign policy known as the Truman Doctrine, which was to counter the Soviet geopolitical expansions during the Cold War. President Truman also signed Executive Order 9835 on March 21st. The order would require all federal employees to be screened for loyalty to the United States, including ensuring that employees were not associated or sympathetic to organizations that were determined to be, quote, totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive, unquote. This included labor unions. This, among other acts such as the Taft-Hartley Act and the House Un-American Activities Committee accusing Alger Hiss, a top President Roosevelt aide and high-level State Department official, of being a communist spy, fueled the return of anti-communist hysteria and the beginnings of what would become known as McCarthyism. In 1950, Wisconsin Senator Joe McCarthy launched a congressional investigation into the cover-up of spies inside the United States government after presenting a list of alleged members of the Communist Party working in the State Department. He used the media as a tool to make allegations against government employees. And while his power died after Eisenhower called for the Republican Party to censor him, McCarthyism was born and spread through the country to entertainers, academics, and labor activists. The anti-communist rhetoric led to the blacklisting and the ruining of careers of people who were accused of being communists or communist sympathizers, and in some cases even the jailing of accused communists, although these convictions were later overturned when the laws were found to be unconstitutional. This blacklisting included entertainers, with the infamous Hollywood 10 being accused of injecting communist propaganda into their productions. The Hollywood 10 consisted of screenwriters Alvar Bessie, Lester Cole, Ring Lardner Jr., John Howard Lawson, Albert Maltz, Samuel Ornitz, Dalton Trumbo, screenwriter-director Herbert Biberman, director Edward Dmytryk, and producer-screenwriter Dalton Trumbo. Each of the 10 were cited for contempt of Congress after some refused to answer questions about their alleged communist agenda. Originally, 79 individuals were subpoenaed to appear, but the previously named 10 were the only ones to appear. On December 3, 1947, the president of the Motion Picture Association of America, Eric Johnston, issued what would become known as the Waldorf Statement. This statement, released in response to the contempt charges of the 10, deplored the men's actions and suspended those who were employed by members of the association, as well as a blacklisting of the 10 from future employment in the industry, as well as pledging to not knowingly employ other people who may be communists. Decades later, Lester Cole would admit in his biography that the 10 were all sometime members of the Communist Party USA, and other members of the 10 would have also admitted to being communists, stating that nothing subversive had been included in the silver screen. Whilst hysteria more often than not leads to innocent people being persecuted, sometimes it is proven that although not part of a larger conspiracy, some people are in fact acting against the best interests of society. Normally these are individuals or very small groups, often acting on their own personal motives or beliefs. In the majority of cases though, the hysteria is led by fear caused by lies and teachings of those who have their own agendas, as seen in the Jewish blood libel, or by a lack of scientific and medical knowledge, as seen in the Salem witch trials, or by fear of being taken over by other political ideologies, as seen in McCarthyism. Whilst this is not a definitive account of the history of hysteria, it is a kicking off point that sees parallels in the Satanic Panic era, with false convictions and innocent people accused of terrible things. In episode 2, we will discuss the pre-panic 1960s and 1970s, and the rise of horror movies, rock music, and the Church of Satan. Thank you for listening to this, the first episode of our deep dive into the Satanic Panic era. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and for following us on social media, at RitualisticP on Twitter, at RitualisticPod on Instagram, or by searching for Ritualistic Podcast on Facebook. If you wish to provide constructive feedback, feel free to email us on ritualisticpod@gmail.com. If you wish to donate to our research fund that helps us purchase books and other research materials, you can do so by sending it through PayPal and entering ritualisticpod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, stay calm, and please don't panic.